She didn't ask for a salute. She didn't even ask for respect. All Sergeant Caroline Vega needed that morning was a pair of boots and a hydration rig to help out with a training event. But instead of assistance, she got laughter, disbelief, mockery from young officers who never saw the wars she survived. They looked at her weathered jacket and saw a joke. What they didn't know, what they never thought to ask, was who she really was, and what that faded patch on her shoulder once meant. It only took one question from a silent figure across the room to change everything. A question from a general who remembered, and with it, the room fell silent. The Georgia humidity hit like a wet blanket as the sun climbed over Fort Brightmoor. The base was already alive with motion, diesel engines humming, cadence calls echoing off aging concrete, and the scent of strong coffee wafting out from the chow hall. Monday morning was in full swing, and no one was in a good mood about it. Amidst the bustle, no one noticed the old Ford Ranger pulling into the depot lot. The woman who stepped out moved with purpose. Sergeant Caroline Vega, 52, didn't walk with ease anymore. An old injury to her right knee saw to that. But she still carried herself with the posture of someone who once stood daily at attention. Her dark hair, now streaked with gray, was pulled into a tight bun more from habit than regulation. Caroline had served 20 years, most of them in the kind of places maps don't label. 8 years into retirement, the uniform was gone, but the instinct remained, scanning exits, tracking sound, bracing for the unexpected. Her civilian clothes were plain, jeans and a shirt tucked neatly beneath a sun-bleached field jacket that had seen too many deserts, too many storms. She hadn't come to Fort Brightmoor to make a scene. The base had posted a request for civilian volunteers to support a logistics training event. No pay, just meals. She was between contract jobs and restless. Helping out felt right. Inside the depot, the morning chaos had begun. Soldiers moved between aisles of gear, barking requests, signing forms. Caroline checked her list. Hydration system, size 8 boots, work gloves, tape. Nothing special, just the kind of gear that kept people alive in bad places. Behind the counter, a young private squinted at a terminal. A trio of lieutenants, barely out of ROTC by the look of their fresh uniforms, lounged near the boot section. When their eyes caught Caroline's jacket, amusement flickered across their faces. One of them, a tall man with a rugby build and a name tape reading Lieutenant Sanderson, snorted. "She forget Halloween's not until October?" "Bet she found that jacket in a surplus bin," said another. The third chimed in, louder than necessary. "Or her grandfather's closet. You know how these wannabes are." They laughed, confident in their rank, unaware of the weight sewn into that jacket's fading threads. The insignia on her shoulder was nearly invisible, washed out from time and sun, but to someone who knew, it still whispered of things never written down. Caroline said nothing. She didn't need to, because soon, someone else would speak for her. Caroline reached for a hydration pack on the shelf, her movements calm and efficient. She didn't flinch at the officer's laughter behind her. She'd endured worse in places with no air conditioning, no backup, and no margin for error. But that didn't make it right. And this time, they weren't just mocking a jacket. They were mocking a life they couldn't begin to understand. As she approached the counter, the private behind it, barely 20, name tape reading Collins, gave her a nervous smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Paperwork?" She handed over a printed authorization letter. 3 pages, signed, stamped, and very much legitimate. Collins scanned it, then frowned. "System says you need active duty clearance or an assigned unit code." He tapped the keyboard again. "I can't override it unless my supervisor signs off, and he's at briefing." Caroline nodded once, unfazed. She moved to the bench by the back wall, sat down quietly, and waited. That's when Lieutenant Sanderson stepped closer. "Need some help with that form?" he asked, mock polite, reaching for the paperwork as if he owned the place. He held it up to the light like he was checking for forgeries. Convincing, but we see these all the time. Anyone with a printer can look official. Behind him, his two buddies, Lieutenant Price and Lieutenant Voss, watched with amused detachment. "She probably hands out fake war stories at the VFW," Price whispered, not whispering at all. "Classified missions. Ribbons you can't Google. Whole stolen Valor starter pack." "She's probably got a drawer full of them," Voss chuckled. "Made-up patches and a scar from bumping into a coffee table." Caroline didn't respond. She kept her eyes forward, her hands resting on the gear list in her lap. She had no obligation to explain anything to anyone, especially not to three lieutenants playing soldier in peacetime. Then, something shifted. A fourth cup of coffee landed on the table behind the lieutenants, not hard, but with enough weight to silence them. The ceramic mugs clinked gently, followed by the unmistakable stillness of presence. The man who had arrived wore faded OCPs, sleeves rolled high, revealing old inked stories, airborne wings, a Pathfinder arrowhead, deployment bands like a living record of places most people couldn't spell. His name tape read simply, Reyes. The one beneath it, Brig. Jen. The lieutenants froze. "Jesus," someone whispered. "That's Brigadier General Elias Reyes." "The guy from Fallujah?" one of them asked, throat dry. No one answered. Reyes didn't acknowledge them. He picked up the fifth cup of black coffee and walked straight toward Caroline Vega, each step deliberate. He stopped behind her, voice low but firm. "That patch on your shoulder." The depot went quiet. Caroline didn't turn around, but her posture changed. Straighter, like she'd heard a familiar command voice in a place she thought she'd left behind. "Where'd you serve with the 519th Echo?" Reyes asked. Caroline's reply was quiet, steady. "Started with them during Black Dune, finished on Crimson Ridge." To the lieutenants nearby, those words meant nothing. But to General Reyes, they hit like coordinates drawn in fire. He stepped forward, now standing beside her, eyes locked on the ghost of a patch that most had forgotten, or never even knew existed. He nodded slowly. "Most folks think that unit never existed," he said. "Pentagon's official records say so." Caroline finally looked up at him. "It existed," she said simply, "for 7 years. Then half of us got folded into phantom units. The rest were debriefed into silence." The air in the depot thickened. Even the forklift in the back had gone silent. Reyes turned to the private at the counter. "Private Collins, this is Sergeant First Class Caroline Vega, formerly of the 519th Echo Response Group, Joint Task Command." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. She's to be given full cooperation. No forms, no waiting, no questions. That's a direct order. "Yes, sir," Collins said, standing at full attention. Behind them, no one laughed anymore, and the woman they thought was no one had just become unforgettable. The depot had never been this quiet. Even the ever-present hum of the vending machines seemed to dim beneath the weight of General Reyes's words. What began as routine ridicule had transformed into institutional silence. The lieutenants who just moments before were laughing were now locked in place, standing straighter than they had all morning, eyes cast downward, hearts pounding with a creeping realization. They had crossed a line they didn't even know existed. The general didn't linger on their embarrassment. He stepped forward with clarity and command, locking eyes with the sergeant major who had just emerged from the back office. The older NCO was built like a bulldozer, with a scar bisecting one eyebrow and a pace that suggested he'd been in uniform longer than any of the officers had been alive. "Sergeant Major," General Reyes said evenly, "this is Sergeant First Class Caroline Vega. She served under Joint Task Command in Echo Response Group, Operations Black Dune and Crimson Ridge." The sergeant major blinked. Then his gaze dropped to Caroline's shoulder, to the ghosted outline of the insignia no one had taken seriously. And then, his expression changed. Not in recognition of her personally, but of what she represented. He'd heard whispers, rumors passed in quiet between deployments, in secure rooms where documents had no copies and files had no names. Echo, the unit that didn't exist. Until now. That unit ran under triple black protocols, General Reyes continued, his voice carrying across the entire depot. Zero press, minimal records, total deniability. He turned to the room now, no longer just speaking to the sergeant major or the private behind the counter. He was addressing everyone. But I know it existed, he said, because on October 15, 2011, at Crimson Ridge outside Kandahar, my convoy, 3 vehicles, 57 personnel, was ambushed. We lost air support. No extraction available. Taliban held the high ground on 3 sides. We were boxed in, running low on ammo, carrying wounded. His voice never rose, but it didn't need to. The intensity lived in the details. We radioed for help. None came, until Echo did, without orders, without cover. They engaged the flank, drew fire, and bought us the minutes we needed to break contact. We got our wounded out. We lived, because they didn't wait for permission. He turned to Caroline. She was part of that. I saw that insignia through a pair of dust-covered binoculars as her unit moved in low through the ravine, ghosts with rifles, moving like they'd done this before, and knew they might not do it again. The sergeant major's jaw tightened. Understood, sir. Full respect, full support, immediately. Private Collins, still red-faced and visibly shaken, gave a rigid nod and turned back to his terminal. Right away, sir. His fingers trembled as he typed, bypassing every clearance screen with override codes, not daring to look up. One of the lieutenants, Sanderson, the one who had led the jokes, took a hesitant step forward. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice almost lost in the stillness. I want to apologize. I didn't realize." Caroline met his eyes with a gaze that held neither fury nor forgiveness, just calm, earned weight. "You didn't ask," she said quietly. Those 3 words hit harder than any reprimand. They were a lesson, a warning, and a mercy all at once. Behind them, another soldier returned from the back with a full gear pack. New boots, hydration system, gloves, all perfectly packed and sealed. General Reyes personally placed the items on the counter. "You're good to go, Sergeant," he said. "No favor, just overdue correction." Caroline gave him a short nod. "Appreciated." The depot began to hum again, but the energy had shifted. What had started as another Monday morning now carried the weight of history, and the uncomfortable truth that legends don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear old jackets with faded patches. As she gathered her gear, Sanderson approached again, slower this time, hands behind his back in genuine contrition. "Maybe next time," he said. "We ask first." Caroline gave him a look that wasn't warm, but wasn't cold either. That would be a good start. And with that, she turned to leave. But before she could reach the door, General Reyes called out again, not with orders, but something more personal. "You know," he said, walking with her toward the exit, "we've got joint training next month. Could use someone with your kind of experience, running interference ops." She paused, adjusting the strap of her gear bag. "Consulting work?" she asked. "Something like that." She glanced back toward the depot where 3 young officers were likely having the worst and most necessary morning of their career. "Might be good for them," she said with a slight smirk, "to work with someone who's actually been there." Reyes smiled. "Might be." She nodded once more. "I'll think about it, General." He stopped, then corrected gently, "Reyes, just Reyes," and they walked on. 2 veterans, shadows behind them, walking not toward glory, but toward quiet understanding. The sun was already high over Fort Brightmoor by the time Sergeant Caroline Vega stepped outside with her gear in hand. The Georgia heat pressed down like a weight, but it felt lighter now, not because the temperature had changed, but because something else had. The silence in the depot was no longer dismissive. It was reverent. She made her way across the lot, boots under one arm, hydration rig slung over her shoulder. Behind her, the depot was no longer just a place to grab MREs and duct tape. It had become a classroom. And the lesson had been unforgettable. Inside, the lieutenants stood still. The laughter that once echoed between aisles of gear had vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable sound of reflection. They weren't used to being humbled. They weren't used to being wrong, at least not this wrong. But now, standing there in their crisp uniforms and polished boots, they looked smaller, and maybe that was a good thing. Near the counter, Private Collins was still typing furiously, finalizing the last overrides as if to make up for every moment he hadn't recognized the weight of the woman before him. His ears still burned red, but his spine had straightened, and for the first time, he looked at the ID on the counter not as a barcode, but as a name tied to a legacy. General Reyes didn't linger inside. He caught up with Caroline halfway across the gravel lot, walking in quiet step beside her as if this was just another patrol, just another day moving forward from a place you can never quite leave behind. The depot faded into the background, its clanging and shouting returning, but never quite the same. At the edge of the lot, by her truck baking in the sun, they paused. "You didn't have to step in," she said, not looking at him. "No," he replied, "but I should have years ago." A beat passed, the kind of beat that carries weight between people who have survived the same storms. "You know what struck me most," he continued, "the way you didn't explain yourself, didn't demand respect." Caroline gave a small shrug. "If they can't see it, explaining won't fix it." He nodded. "But someone has to call it out when they don't." She opened the back door of her truck and slid the gear inside. Dust kicked up around the tires. She turned back, her expression softer than it had been all morning. "They'll remember today," she said. "Good," he replied. "They should." He hesitated for a moment longer, then said, "That training op next month, we could use someone to teach them the difference between title and leadership." She considered it, not just for the sake of the lieutenants, for herself, for the ones who never got a moment like this, for the ones still carrying weight with no one to help them set it down. "Maybe," she said. He gave her a final nod. "You'll know if it's time." And just like that, he turned and walked away, not toward the command building, but into the midday heat, disappearing into the movement of the base like a ghost into a crowd. Caroline climbed into her truck and sat for a long moment before starting the engine. Through the windshield, the depot looked like it always had, concrete, beige, loud. But now she knew the whispers had started. By evening, every barracks would know what happened, about the woman with the old jacket, the ghost unit. And the day, silence got broken by truth. She didn't need a salute. She didn't need applause. She just needed someone to remember. And now they would. The truck rolled slowly down the long base road, sun glare bouncing off the hood, dust rising behind its tires like a soft trail of memory. Sergeant Caroline Vega didn't turn on the radio. She didn't need the noise. The silence was enough, full of weight, but no longer burden. She had come for a hydration rig and a pair of boots. That was all. But somehow, this Monday morning had become something far larger. A reckoning, not just for a few cocky lieutenants, but for an institution that often forgets its own ghosts. The worn jacket on her shoulders didn't look any newer. The faded patch still whispered in threadbare shadows, but it felt different now. Not like something she had to defend, but something that had, at long last, been acknowledged. In another corner of the base, Lieutenant Sanderson sat alone in the empty briefing room, staring at a blank piece of paper. He'd been told to draft a summary of what happened. But what could he possibly say? That he'd laughed at a hero? That he'd seen a ghost rise and shake the room with nothing but presence? His pen hovered, but the words never came. Because some lessons don't fit on paper. They have to be carried. Back in her apartment that night, Caroline took off the jacket and hung it on a wooden hanger. She smoothed the fabric out, careful with the fraying seams. For a moment, her fingers paused at the shoulder, right where the phantom patch had once declared her place in the world. No medals, no parade, just memory and quiet pride. She sat down at her small kitchen table, opened a faded notebook, and wrote only one sentence. They didn't ask, but someone remembered. Outside, the streetlights blinked on. Another quiet night in a quiet life. But something had changed, not just at Fort Brightmoor, not just in the depot, in the story, because someone had seen her, had called her by name, had remembered the unit the world chose to forget. And that was enough.